502 podcast, Press Meyer back once again, joined today by Evan Miyakawa of EvanMiya.com, a name that people are learning to appreciate in the college basketball world. So we figured we'd have him by and ask a bunch of nerdy basketball related questions. Evan, how are you, sir?
I'm doing good. Glad to be here. Obviously, the season's a couple weeks in the rear view mirror, but there is so much stuff happening in the transfer portal and all this stuff that it still feels like we're right in the thick of it.
Yeah, it's great in a sense, right? Like everybody talks about how the NFL season, most of the action happens outside the season, right? And college sports are becoming much the same now, right? So it's fascinating to be able to watch that as a college fan and the evolution of college basketball, the way that things change even on a year-to-year basis is pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, just the insane changes that we have seen in how teams have approached the off seasons, even from 2 years ago to last year to this year, has been every single season. People are still caught off guard by how much it's changing, even though they expect it to change. That's how much it's been just a whirlwind.
You have to be ready for things literally week to week and day to day to be completely different. So, well, Evan, I think a great way to start, if you are not familiar with college basketball analytics, if you just tune in and just watch, 31 college basketball games a year, Evan's still a good guy to know. And so I guess my first question for you, you're a data scientist essentially, right? You're a data analyst. So how did you get into analytics?
It's a great question. So yeah, college basketball has been my favorite sport my entire life. I grew up a Butler Bulldogs fan. I lived about 10 minutes from Hinkle Fieldhouse. I went to that Duke National Championship game against Butler when Gordon Hayward almost hit that half-court shot. So for me, like, college basketball has always been my favorite sport. I ended up getting my PhD in statistics from Baylor University. Of all the different things that I could do, applying statistics to sports has always been the most natural thing for me, especially when I think about college basketball and March Madness. And so after I got my PhD, actually, while I was still in school, I ended up creating this website, initially just kind of as a fun side project to just dabble with some numbers and things I was learning in school and put together some team ratings and some player ratings and stuff like that. And then I ended up getting a job out of my degree working for a sports analytics company working with professional NBA teams with their front offices.
Okay.
But on the side, my website just continued to grow to the point where I was actually able to say, like, hey, I can do this full time if I want. And this is really what I care about. And so it's kind of grown organically to the point where it's now used by tons of coaches and journalists and fans for analyzing the sport. And so that's really how I got into it. It definitely wasn't my initial plan when I started it, but it's been really, really cool to see it kind of grow in this way.
That's a great question. When's the first time somebody that I'm sure that there's been people that it's been kind of a shock, right? That they've reached out to you or that somebody, a member of their team reached out, right? When was the first time that really kind of resonated with you? Like, wow, this is something that people legitimately value my input and my opinion.
Honestly, there's been little points like that throughout the last 4 or 5 years. Even when I was still just in the very early stages of this, I had like Pat Kelsey reached out to me back when he was the coach at Winthrop, and he was like trying to gain an edge with player minutes allocation back then. And my website was nothing compared to what it is now in terms of just presentation and ease of use, and yet there were already coaches back then who were trying to like find every small angle with things like that. And fast forward to today, I've had the great opportunity the last couple of years to go to the Final Four as a media member, get to go to all the games and press conferences and all that stuff for free. But it's also been cool because I get to walk around and talk to all of these people who have been college basketball media for some of them for 3 or 4 decades. There's obviously a lot of coaches who are in town during the Final Four, and I've had the opportunity to like go and shake a lot of their hands, and most, if not all of them, have known who I am and are like excited about what I'm doing, which has been really cool. Definitely just makes me thank the Lord every day for this opportunity and for being able to have this kind of impact. And so I don't necessarily think there was like one particular point. There's been a lot of things across the road or, during that time, but it's all been really cool.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the PK connection, that's a fascinating story in and of itself, but just having been a part of this and witnessing who he is as a person does not surprise me one bit. Does not surprise me in the least that he's a guy that would reach out, right? So, but before we get into too much Louisville specific things, tell people what is it about your metrics that kind of set you apart from other data sets, right? Like what I know that KenPom is kind of like I think he's really probably the pinnacle of what this is, right? But I think that a lot of people are starting to gravitate towards sites like yours. So explain what it is that you do that's different than other metrics.
Yeah, at a surface level, what I do is similar to KenPom in the sense that I am rating, kind of predicting the efficiency of all the teams in college basketball. But a lot of what I do that makes my site unique is at the player and the lineup level. I have a metric called Bayesian performance rating that I believe to be the best all-in-one measure of how valuable or impactful a player is to his team on the court, because it looks at your individual stats. It also looks at your impact on team performance when you're on the court. It also has some historical information about each player, like how you've performed in previous seasons and the level of recruit you were coming out of high school. That all predicts how you're going to do going forward. And that's what makes it so useful during the transfer portal season, is because I have values on offense and defense for every player that takes all of that information into account and predicts how good they're going to be next year. Not just how good they were this last season, but actually taking into account some statistics that point to potential of a level of play that you might not have reached in a previous season, but that you're capable of going forward. So all of that is a big part of what makes what I do unique. And then I also have a lot of lineup stuff that is very unique in the space, where I'm rating the performance of every single 5-man lineup in the country, but you can also drill that down into 2-man combinations or 3-man lineups. And you can also predict too the effectiveness of those lineups going forward, so that it doesn't overreact to small sample sizes. So there's a lot of stuff like that, but I would say the player evaluation side of things and the lineup stuff is really probably the bread and butter that sets me apart the most.
Yeah, I think that's what stood out initially. The first time anybody would open your website, I think if you just do a little bit of digging, that's one of the number one things, is that there is a really clear and concise way of measuring a player's value to his team. My follow-up question to that, I think maybe like an Isaac McKneely is a perfect example for Louisville this year. Like a guy that great player, like clearly he's above the mean in college basketball on an average to below average team. How much does the team factor weigh in?
It's a good question. During a season, the theory behind a lot of how this works is, if you're a really, really good player and you're stuck on a bad team, obviously your individual stats should still be fairly productive, even if don't have as many good pieces around you. But the other thing too is that there should be a clear difference between how the team is performing when you're on the court versus off the court. If you stuck, Cooper Flagg on Middle Tennessee State, there should be a pretty clear difference between how good of a team they are with Flagg on the court versus not on the court. And so the data is going to find that if it's there. And so it's going to still be able to tell, like, hey, even though the team stinks, this player is clearly having an impact in a very positive way when he's on the court. And we've seen this with a lot of the best players in the country the last couple of years. Like, Purdue was a really good team last year without Zach Edey on the court. And then with Zach Edey on the court, it was still like a whole nother level. Like, you take his individual stats out of it, Purdue was just playing at a better level when he was on the court.
Right.
So if you have a player who you believe to be by far your team's best player, there should be data to support that. Outside of your individual counting stats, you should also be able to find lots of examples of how the team is just playing at a higher level when this player's on the court. And if that's not there, that doesn't necessarily mean that player isn't your best player, but it might mean that there's just a little bit of maybe caution with asserting that he's far and away your best player. So all of that stuff is taken into account when you're then projecting for like an Isaac McKneely, how he's going to be next year. The team impact stuff matters a little bit less. It's not quite as predictive when you're moving from one team to another. So that doesn't carry quite as much weight as the individual stats, but it's certainly still a factor that can differentiate some, two players with very equivalent statistical profiles, but one of them had a really positive impact on team performance and one had a negative impact. They're going to be rated differently in terms of the transfer portal projections.
Love that. Great explanation. And I think it leads perfectly into, what a lot of people want to hear about. And that's Louisville basketball as a whole, right? People are tuning in to find out, is Louisville going to be better this coming year than last year? And I think that's a great way to put it. Based on your projections, I think last year there's a lot that goes into it when you have 13 brand new players that are trying to assimilate. So this year, with it kind of being more half and half, really Louisville's only brought in 3 transfers through the portal. So in your opinion, though, what is the talent level that Louisville's brought in now compared to maybe some of the top level players that they brought in a season ago?
Well, I think the obvious difference is that they brought in like 10, 11 guys last year. Louisville was one of 6 high major teams to return exactly 0 minutes from their previous season, which had never been done before in a season until last year when you had the likes of Kentucky and Louisville and USC and DePaul and teams like that. And really the only teams out of those 6 that were remotely successful compared to kind of what they were hoping for were Kentucky and Louisville. And I think you would have to argue that the coaching job at both of those schools, I think Louisville in particular, was incredible, because when you looked back at this team coming into the season last year, I think there were hopes that this team would be good enough to make an NCAA tournament. And then they suffer several season-ending injuries and a couple more players who were in and out for big periods of the season. And when you're looking at this team in mid-December, I personally was willing to say, like, just throw this season in the bin because of the incredible amount of unluckiness they've had due to injuries.
Sure.
And then you look at a team that ended up being one of the top 2 to 3 teams in the ACC down the stretch, comfortably made the tournament, was very underseeded. They should have gotten a better seed than they did. They had a really tough first round matchup, obviously. But I think it's very clear that this team overachieved relative to its roster talent last year. And you could say a lot of that's due to Pat Kelsey and his staff, which I think is probably true. So this year, I think the thing with this team is that they're not having to start from scratch last year. They're able to bring back a lot of their, key players. The interesting thing is, guys like, Kasean Pryor and Ali Khalifa were on the roster last year, but either didn't play at all or were severely limited in terms of the amount of games they were to play due to injury. So, like, that's not a very traditional, like, returning piece in the sense that they didn't get full run last year. So that's a little bit of an interesting thing. But the 3 transfers that they have brought in this offseason in Ryan Conwell, Isaac McKneely, and Adrian Woolley are all very, very good players. And so I think the difference is they had to bring in a lot of volume last year. I think there were probably 1 or 2 players. Chucky Hepburn was definitely kind of at that level. But these 3 guys, especially according to my model, Conwell and McNeely are some of the best transfers available in the country. And, we can get into this, but there's some clear trends that I see with the skill sets that those 3 guys bring that I think is uniquely suited for Pat Kelsey's style this year.
Yeah, I love that. I think a great place to start is Isaac McKneely, right? I know that Louisville and Conwell and Adrian Woolley, those guys could ultimately end up being the 2 better out of the 3 players. They could. But to me, Isaac McKneely stood out all season long as a guy who was just light years ahead of everybody else on his team on a an uncharacteristically bad Virginia team. So how much does your kind of data set? I know you talked about how it factors in, but when you're factoring in the fact that he played with a lot less talent around him, and he still scored and shot the ball at such a highly efficient clip. What does that say about him as a player and how he projects going forward?
Well, the thing that sticks out about Isaac McKneely is that even when you account for how bad his team was and how it was very clear that when other teams played him, they were going to try and take his game away because he was the number 1 weapon on that team.
Sure.
Even when you take all of that into account, he was still so successful from 3 last year that one of the things that I do on my website is I look at every single player's like individual statistical performance. So one of the things I look at is 3-point shooting. I'll take your entire career game log in terms of how you shot from 3 and who you played against, the offensive context and all that stuff. And I predict how good you're going to be in that skill going forward, kind of adjusting for all of that and giving you more credit if you're playing against harder teams and all that sort of stuff. Isaac McKneely last year ended the year as the 3rd best 3-point shooting projection or grade in the entire country behind only Kobe Bryant and LJ Cryer. Both those guys are gone next year. So he's going to enter the season as the best 3-point shooter in the entire country. And that's who Louisville just got on their team. And so obviously that's going to be a very coveted player for any team. We saw the effectiveness that Kobe Bryant was able to have for Kentucky this year coming in as like the premier 3-point shooting threat. There really wasn't a lot else to Kobe Brea's game, other than that, coming into the year, he developed a lot as the year went along. But I think something McNeely also has that makes him unique too is that for someone who's a lethal knockdown three-point shooter, he's also a very good playmaker in the sense that he has a really good assist grade on my website in terms of it's distributing for others, and he doesn't turn the ball over hardly at all. So for someone who has the ball in his hands that much and is shooting and also trying to make plays for others when they're taking his shot away, he doesn't give the ball over that much. So when I look at all those things, his offensive profile is really, really unique, and I think is going to make him a very, very good fit for this team next year.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that just a little bit. You talked about some of those kind of common denominators among these players. Clearly, the staff went out and targeted very specific guys, and then they landed their guys, which, kudos to them, right? But what are some of those common denominators? What is the profile of these players that they're bringing in?
Well, the main thing I noticed is that we talked about McNeely shooting, but Conwell and Woolley also are very, very good three-point shooters. They're both in the top 5% nationally in terms of that projected three-point shooting skill for next year. That's really rare to have three guys on your roster who are all that elite in three-point shooting. And so it's very clear that, Pat Kelsey is trying to take the progress they made last year and emphasize the three-point shooting even more. And so when you have three guys capable of all being on the court at the same time, who are all that lethal from three, that makes me very excited. So to me, that's the biggest thing here. In terms of other things, though, like all of these guys just in general are very capable scorers. They're not just three-point shooting threats. They can score from a lot of different places on the court. The best player in terms of these three guys, according to my model, is Ryan Conwell. I think he's one of the top 20 players in the portal. And the thing too is when you look at all of his guard skills in terms of shooting and playmaking and turning the ball over and steals and stuff like that you really care about in a guard, he doesn't have any skills that he's like not significantly average in. All of them he's like 70th percentile or better in. It's very rare to have someone who doesn't have a deficiency, you know what I mean? Sure. But he's a very, very good three-point shooter. He's really good at the foul line. He's really good at scoring. He's a good playmaker. Like McNeely, he doesn't turn the ball over hardly at all for someone who has the ball in his hands that much. So there's just really not a lot of weaknesses to his game. And I personally am really excited to see him play for Louisville because he's played for, teams the last 2 years who were not capable of really doing a lot in the tournament. And now he actually has an opportunity to kind of be the lead guy on a team that is going to have significant aspirations to win multiple tournament games and, potentially compete for a conference title and things like that. So I'm really, really excited about Conwell. Woolley, to me, is the third best of those guys. That's maybe not necessarily consensus opinion. My model is just a little bit lower on him, and I think a lot of that has to do with the expected step up in competition from playing at Kennesaw State to going into the ACC. There are some guys who are able to really excel going from a much lower conference to a higher level, but there are certain statistical profiles that are better than that than others. And for someone whose like main attribute is being a volume scorer, a lot of times those guys struggle to be as efficient when they go to the high major level. So that pulls his projection back a little bit, but I still think there's a ton of potential with him as well.
Yep. Just kind of absurd depth as far as just the types of players that Louisville has in this backcourt. Final kind of Louisville-centric question. I want to be respectful of your time as well. You have Javon Hadley and Kasean Pryor returning on this team. And now Kasean Pryor only played 7 games before a season-ending injury, but he was probably the most productive and most used player on this team. And then conversely, you have Javon Hadley, who's more of a do-it-all type of guy, but he played almost identical minutes to Chucky Hepburn. So we're talking about, a guy that was heavily relied upon. What is the significance of a guy like Kasean Pryor or even a guy like Javon Hadley coming back?
I think it's big. And I think the thing is I'm just looking at where all the players on Louisville's roster ended this season in terms of their end of season BPR. And because it's a per possession metric, it doesn't like dock you for not having played more than several games because basically, once Pryor got hurt, his rating just stays the same for the rest of the year because it's predicting how good he's going to be going forward. So when I look at the entire Louisville roster from last year in terms of how they ended the season, Pryor ended as the 3rd best player on the team and Hadley was 5th. So you're bringing back 2 of your top 5 guys in terms of per possession production last year back, and those guys are probably going to be a little bit, compared to the new flashy pieces they have, they might be a little bit underrated in that sense, especially Pryor, just because he hardly played at all. so I think getting those guys back, like we could be looking a month into the season and be like, their transfers are great, but like, man, these guys, I kind of forgot about how important they would be to this team.
Sure.
So I think it's huge to get those guys back. And when you look at the trends in college basketball in terms of what it takes to build a Final Four level team, the strategy that has been the most successful the last several years, even with all this transfer portal movement, is keeping and retaining your key guys who were on the roster the previous season, and then adding the talent around them, through the portal, but not overemphasizing those newcomers. That's what Louisville's doing this year. They returned a lot of their key guys from last year, and then they go and they get Conwell, McNeely, and Woolley, who are all really talented. But it's not like they're rehauling their entire roster and just getting all of this fresh talent in. They're saying, hey, we still want these guys back. And I think that's going to has been really successful for a lot of teams. And now that they have the luxury to do that in year two, I think it should be pretty successful.
One more question before we get out of here. I think that one thing that's a concern for Louisville fans is do they need to front load the schedule next season? I mean, you end up landing an 8 seed in the NCAA tournament after going 18-2 in the ACC. Literally, there's 3 teams that have won that many games in ACC history: Duke, Louisville, and Clemson, all last year. And so with that in mind, drawing a team like Creighton, and then even if they beat Creighton, playing Auburn, a Final Four team in the second round is kind of a travesty, really, right? So with all that in mind, though, the ACC strength needs to take a step up in the coming years. Is there a chance that happens? And then who are the obvious people, who are the obvious teams that could take a step forward next season?
Yeah, I think we saw an aberrationally bad ACC this year. Mm-hmm. I just find it hard to believe that we're going to see a conference that poor in the ACC again in a long time. And so I think overreacting to how bad the ACC was last year and saying that's how bad it's going to be again this year and we need to front load our schedule, I think is probably a little bit of an overreaction. But obviously, I think playing really high caliber opponents in the non-conference is still really, really good training for the rest of the season. And, we saw in the Final Four this year, Auburn and Houston and Duke all scheduled really aggressively in the non-conference. And I think that paid off for them because, Duke rolled through the ACC and then hardly missed a beat in the tournament once they actually started playing good teams, if you want, if you compared to a lot of the ACC talent that they saw, because Absolutely. I think a lot of they got those experiences in November and December and even, a game against Illinois in February. So I think it's still important, but I do not expect the ACC to be as bad as it was last year. And even just looking at the work that some of these ACC teams have done in the offseason, like Louisville has had a really strong offseason. I think Clemson has brought in a lot of really good pieces. Syracuse, NC State is bringing in more guys. So I think a lot of these programs who were kind of middling last year or a lot worse than expected are going to have a bounce back. And even with some of the, coaching wise, the ACC has kind of cleared out a little bit of the people who are struggling recently and brought in fresh coaches. So the talent pool in terms of the coaching should be a bit better. So I'm a bit optimistic, in terms of how this conference is going to do, but you're still only talking about a conference that at its best probably is the 3rd best conference in the country.
Sure.
And its worth is, 5th or 6th. And so, I do think it is important to get high quality opponents on the schedule in those first 2 months of the season for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Evan Miyakawa, thank you so much for joining us. Tell everybody where they can find your work.
Sure. So everything is at EvanMiya.com. There's links to all of my social media platforms on there. I'm very active on Twitter, but I'm also on Instagram and TikTok. I also have a blog that I post to semi-regularly. I'm doing a lot of transfer portal focused stuff this offseason, so you can find a link there. So yeah, EvanMiya.com is where you can find all that stuff.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time. The fans are going to enjoy this, and we will take every ounce of every shred of content that we can get in the long college basketball offseason. Evan, thanks so much again.
This is great. Thank you for having me.
Yeah.